Okay, 674 is where we'll begin. We'll just do the first, second, and fourth. I have decided to follow Jesus. 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 No turning back, no turning back. A world behind me, cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back. All right, our next one will be 749. And the battle belongs to the Lord at 749. We'll do all three on this one. In heavenly armor we'll enter the land. The battle belongs to the Lord. No weapon that's fashioned against us will stand. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power, and strength to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power, and strength to the Lord. When the power of darkness comes in like a flood, the battle belongs to the Lord. He's raised up a standard, the power of his blood. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power, and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power, and strength to the Lord. When your enemy presses in hard, do not fear. The battle belongs to the Lord. Take courage, my friend, your redemption is near. The battle belongs to the Lord. And we sing glory, honor, power, and strength to the Lord. We sing glory, honor, power, and strength to the Lord. German.
Let us pray. Father in heaven, be with us as we study your word this evening. Help us to be able to focus on what David wants to teach us tonight. Help us to have a great Bible study. Be with all those that are not able to be here, whether it be through sickness or spiritual sickness, regular sickness or spiritual sickness. Be with all those that are traveling also. In Christ we pray. Amen.
All right. Let's be opening up to Mark, and we're going to be beginning chapter 3 tonight. Turn this off, yeah. Now, here in chapter 3, Mark begins this chapter by continuing to record some of the things that Jesus did in his ministry during the Sabbath. What is also continuing to be recorded here is how the Jewish religious leaders, called the Pharisees, responded to the things that he did in the Sabbath. Now, we should remember that part of the reason the Pharisees raised issue with some of the things that Jesus did on the Sabbath is because they believed some of the things he and his disciples did qualified as work, which of course was not permitted on the Sabbath. So as we come to verses 1 through 6 of chapter 3, we find another example of Jesus' dealings with the Pharisees in regard to the Sabbath. Now, more specifically, what we find in these verses is Mark, he presents a situation where Jesus is once again in a Jewish synagogue, and among those present, there was this man whose hand was withered. And Mark tells us that since this was the case, the Pharisees, who were also present, they were there watching to see what Jesus would do with this man. That's the scene. So, since that's the scene, what Mark records in verses 1 through 6 are 3 points about Jesus' dealings with the Pharisees. There's the man whose hand was withered, but the focus is really on the interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees here. The first point we'll see in verses 1 and 2 about the Pharisees is that they sought to accuse Jesus. Verses 3 through 5, the Pharisees were confronted by Jesus. And finally, in verse 6 is where we learn that the Pharisees were among those who were conspiring to destroy Jesus. Now, after looking at these things, the application to us is that we'll see is that sometimes in our service to Jesus, we'll sometimes have to deal with religious leaders of sorts in our experience. But we'll talk more about that when we get there. Well, let's begin tonight by reading verses 1 through 6, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Mark chapter 3. The text says, "He entered again into his synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. They were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. He said to the man with the withered hand, 'Get up and come forward.' And he said to them, 'Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?' But they kept silent. After looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him." So again, we're looking at Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees in this particular situation, but verse 1 again sets up the scene. Jesus is in a synagogue. There's this man whose hand was withered. Can anyone tell me what it means when someone has a withered hand? Okay, that might be possible. It's not fully developed. Does anyone else have any other ideas? Okay, maybe he had a stroke. Any other ideas? Might be an injury, maybe a stroke, but this idea of a withered hand, it's referring to a skin condition of sorts. The skin has completely dried up. So now we've had dry hands, we have dry skin, we know what that's like, but this man was to an extreme. The text does not use the word leprosy. We don't have any indication that this was a leopard. All we know is that this was a man who's had a skin condition that caused his hand, the skin on his hand, to be completely dried up. We don't know what that looked like. This is all we're told. So what this tells us then is that all Mark wants us to know here in verse 1 is that at this synagogue that Jesus came to, there was this man with this condition on his hand for reasons unknown to us. Questions or comments on verse 1? So verse 2 is where we get into the nitty-gritty, so to speak. What happens in verse 2? What else is going on? Okay? Who's they? Probably so. And we know that because back in verses 23 through 28, Pharisees were making their own points and things about what Jesus and his disciples would did. So we call that context. They, if we want to figure out who they is, we go back a little bit earlier and see who's the last person that was talked about besides Jesus. The Pharisees. These were the last people Mark was talking about before he entered into chapter 3. So they, logically speaking, has to be the Pharisees in this particular case. So if this is the Pharisees, what are they doing? Well, I kind of already said it. Okay, that's the reality. Yes. So they're watching Jesus.
They needed information and to catch him doing something with what they witnessed, so they could take it to the Sanhedrin, so they could then administer whatever rules they wanted. Because without a true witness, they couldn't do anything.
Right, and this gets into this accuse aspect. They were looking for information. They wanted to see what Jesus would do so they could take that back, as Jeremiah put it, back to the Sanhedrin to bring charges against Jesus. That's what it means to accuse someone, to bring charges against. So that's what the Pharisees are watching for. What is Jesus going to do? Is he going to heal this man? Is what the language verse 2 uses. Questions or comments on verse 2? All right. So we're looking at the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees, putting verses 1 and 2 together. Jesus' dealings with the Pharisees is that they sought to accuse Jesus. That's what might say was their mission, was to bring charges against Jesus. Now in this case, the charges the Pharisees were seeking to bring against Jesus were ones where they would charge Jesus with violating what they believed to be work on the Sabbath. So that brings us into verses 3 through 5, the second point, where now the Pharisees are confronted by Jesus. So as we come into verse 3, what's the first thing that happens? What does Jesus do? Okay, so that's what Jesus does. He sees this man, tells him, get up, come forward. So this is another kind of stage setting verse. Now, why call him forward? What's that? Okay, he's singling him out. But what does this have to do with the Pharisees? Exactly. Jesus is making a point. He knows what the Pharisees are up to. We've already seen that he knows what's going on in people's hearts. So he's about to make a point. But he starts off by calling this man forward. Dean, go ahead. That's possible. So if this was one of the Pharisees in this case, that might be possible. So he calls this man forward. He knows the Pharisees are watching, and he's about to make a point. Anything else on verse 3? Okay. So going on to verse 4, what happens next? Exactly. And what's the question he gives them? Okay. So we have this word lawful here. What does it mean when something is lawful? Is it permitted? That's what this word lawful has to do with. It comes from a word that carries with it the idea of something being permissible. So, this is the question Jesus asked: to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? But he's confronting the Pharisees with this question. So, what does this question mean that he's asking? We'll look at the response in a minute. What's he getting at in this question? No. It's the black and white issue. Jeremiah, go ahead.
It's the only exception to the rule of the Sabbath given in the Old Testament. You could do something if it was for good to save someone. You were allowed to work and not be stoned to death. But it's the only exception that God gave when he gave the commandment for the Sabbath day. Only thing he gave it for was that.
Exactly.
So he's saying I have to. So he threw it back in their face, their rule.
Right. So he's bringing the exception back. Doing something beneficial or doing something harmful. Saving a life, taking a life. So, putting all that together, the question, what all these examples have in common that Jesus uses in his question is either bringing or not bringing relief to those who might be suffering, is this the simplest way to put that. How do the Pharisees respond to this question? Silence. Why? Okay, that's true. But what if they said the opposite? They violated the law. So they're trapped. They're not going to agree with Jesus because that goes against everything they're trying to do. But if they say no to the question, they're going to hear about it from the crowd. So Jesus, what he's essentially done is trap them in their own ideas. Now, and I don't remember exactly where it's at, but it's a situation where I think it's the Pharisees in that case, but they asked Jesus about the baptism, or Jesus asked them about the baptism of John. Is it from heaven or from men? The religious leaders start discussing among themselves, well, if we say this, this is going to happen. If we say that, this is going to happen. So the response, we don't know. Similar situation here. They keep silent because they know they're going to get into trouble no matter how they answer this question. Questions or comments on verse 4? Okay. So verse 5, the Pharisees have kept silent. What happens next in verse 5? How does Jesus respond to the response, or lack thereof? Okay, the text says he's angry, but the text also says something else about how he's feeling. Grieved. So we have two emotions that Jesus is feeling here. He's angry, number one, but he's also grieved. What does it mean when you're grieved? You're saddened. You're hurt. And the text says what he's angry and hurt at is their hardness of heart. What is hardness of heart? Stubbornness is a good word for it. When you're stubborn, you're not changing your mind about something. So the Pharisees are stuck in their ways. And how is their hardness of heart shown in verse 4? Their silence. They had their own ideas. They're not going to budge from them. Therefore, they kept silent. So Jesus, how does he react? He's angry and he's hurt. Because what he's looking for in situations like this, Jesus, is compassion. That's how this man should have been treated. That's how Jesus is treating him. But the Pharisees don't have that compassion within themselves. So he's angry and he's hurt. But what does he do? What does Jesus do with that anger and hurt that he's feeling? Turns it into action for the man. What does he do? Heals the man's hand. What happens to his hand? Restored. What does it mean when something is restored? Taken back to its original condition. That's what this word restored almost literally means. So this man's, if this withered idea is that his skin was completely dried up, Jesus says, stretch out your hand. It's no longer, it looks like a normal hand. So we've seen what Jesus does, but what does he not do with this man? What are we not told in this verse about this healing? Okay, he didn't tell him that. That's true. Okay, he didn't do any work. Now, what do you mean by that, Jeremiah? That's it. As far as we can tell, there was no physical interaction between Jesus and the man. All Jesus did was give a command, which the man obeyed. Now, that's important to notice because in a lot of the healing in stories that we read about, Jesus does something physical. Touches them. In the case where he healed the blind man, put stuff in his eyes. None of that happens here. All Jesus uses to heal this man is his words, which the man obeys. Now, it may not be a big deal to you, but it is to me. That this is a very unique healing story, that there's no touching involved. But as Jeremiah pointed out, even more true to the context is he didn't do what the Pharisees believed to be work. So he is above reproach with the Pharisees. He was even before this point with his question that he asked. So Mark's point of emphasis in this verse is showing how he dealt with the Pharisees. He was angry and hurt at them. As Elaine put it, he turned that into action and set the example by helping this man in the way that he did. Questions or comments on verse 5? Yeah, there is pettiness about this in the Pharisees. Anything else on verse 5? All right, we're not done. But putting verses 3 through 5 together, the Pharisees were confronted by Jesus. Well, that's what Jesus is doing here. He's confronting them with their own ideas about what was permissible on the Sabbath or not. So the Pharisees respond with silence. Jesus is angry and hurt, but turns it into action and heals this man. But again, we're not done. We go into verse 6, the last point about Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees, and that's that they conspired to destroy Jesus. So the healing has happened. We come into verse 6. It can be broken down into two parts. What do the Pharisees do after this point? Okay, what does the text say in verse 6? Okay, so you have the word plotted there. Okay, the American Standard has the word conspiring. But what does it mean to conspire or to plot? To plan. So that's what they start going out and doing. They've seen what has happened. And they bring in with them this group called the Herodians, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. Now, verse 6 is bringing this section to a close. Let's get that in our minds first. But they align themselves with this group called the Herodians. So we have to ask, well, who are these people? Now, when you look at that name, Herodians, what name is in the name? Herod. We know who Herod is. So who are the Herodians? Followers of Herod, people who align themselves with Herod, mainly for political reasons, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the background of these people. But in short, under normal circumstances, the Pharisees and the Herodians really had nothing to do with each other. Pharisees didn't like them. But they align themselves. They form an alliance. Why? Okay, might be convenient. Jeremiah, is your hand up? Thought.
Well, they're the only ones that the Romans will listen to. Matthew being a tax collector, in theory, would have also, if he would have been anything like it, would have been a Herodian, because those were the people who were on the side of Rome. They were Roman citizens, even though they were Jews.
Okay. So yeah, there was some alliance with Rome because of Herod's relationship to Pilate that we read more about closer to the crucifixion. But the Pharisees aligned themselves with these people. So one thing they possibly had in common was they were both opposed to Jesus. Now we ask, well, why were the Herodians opposed to Jesus? One possible reason that's been suggested is because of Jesus' relationship to John the Baptist. Now later, Mark's going to tell us the story in chapter 6 about how John the Baptist condemned Herod because Herod was married to his brother's wife. We read about that in Mark 6, verse 18. John the Baptist says that's not right. But physically speaking, Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins. So this may be one reason that the Herodians were opposed to Jesus, because of his relationship with John the Baptist. So if the Pharisees and the Herodians had anything in common, it was that. They were both in opposition to Jesus. If that's the case, that tells us why the Pharisees go and start making this plan with the Herodians. That's probably true. Right. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's probably also true just based on that information. Just a little footnote I have here in my Bible, which is not as extensive as Dina's, but it says the secular political party, which took its name from Herod Antipas and was strong in its support for Rome, opposed the Pharisees on nearly every issue, but were willing to join forces with them because both desperately wanted to destroy Jesus. So again, that's the commonality. They wanted to destroy Jesus. So that brings us into that second part of the verse. Now, what does the word destroy mean? To totally get rid of. Now, yes, the point is that they want to kill Jesus, but Mark uses this word destroy. It paints a more graphic picture. So the idea here is that they're wanting to silence Jesus. I'll tell Jeremiah, go ahead.
Destroying also doesn't just mean what we're thinking. Destroying his reputation would also mean it would destroy, he wouldn't be a martyr anymore for his cause. So in turn, if you destroy him, you destroy what he taught, and it would in turn replace everybody that thinks he was false.
Yeah, that's part of it. It's also destroying his reputation and just everything. So this is their plan. How are we going to stop him? Ultimately, that's going to result in altogether killing him, but it hasn't reached that point yet. The plan is only now beginning. So it wouldn't happen until the time was right. questions or comments on verse 6? Okay. So the point we should see from verse 6 about Jesus' dealings with the Pharisees is that the Pharisees conspired to destroy Jesus. Now this here in Mark's gospel, this is the very first reference we have to Jesus' death. First one. But it all began here on this, after this situation where Jesus healed this man on the Sabbath, is where the plan began because of the way Jesus confronted them. But the Pharisees are not going to carry out this plan alone. But when we get nearer to the crucifixion, more people are getting involved in this plan. It would be religious people. It's already at this point religious people are involved in the plan to kill Jesus. So putting everything we've looked at together, verses 1 through 6, the point we should be left with is that Jesus had dealings with the Pharisees. They sought to accuse Jesus, they were confronted by Jesus, and they conspired to destroy Jesus. Again, the application, we will have dealings with religious leaders. Now, according to what we studied in these verses, it's just that. Sometimes we'll have dealings with other religious people. Since that's true, we must learn from Jesus as to how to deal with those other religious people of different faiths when those experiences come. Now, something else these verses teach us is that sometimes other religious leaders, they will make us angry. They will hurt us. But it comes from that place of their own hardness of heart. But all the same, we must see how Jesus dealt with the religious leaders of his day and follow in his example as we deal with the religious leaders of our day. Go ahead, Dean. Yeah, there's definitely a threat to power here because of what Jesus was bringing. We see that a lot in the Gospels. Anything else? All right. Dean, will you close us in prayer?